Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, on our penultimate session on Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, we move into the third volume with chapters 37 to 43. Asterisk, we'll get to that in a moment, or that's chapters 1 to 7 of the third volume, if you're so inclined. In this week's reading, secrets are revealed. Many secrets, in fact, are revealed. Edward's situation gets markedly worse and then markedly better. Marianne depends on a standard of medical care that, until very recently, would have seemed unconscionably antiquated, but now seems pretty much the par for the course. And if everything works out, then we will end this week's reading on one of the best cliffhangers in fiction. Just one of the all-time bangers of a cliffhanger as Willoughby returns to the narrative, although that seems unlikely because, though I have said before that my intent is to rein in Stars and Swords and to try and keep this show a little more trim, a little more efficient, my success rate in achieving that goal is approximately 0%. But today, just for today, I have a hard out at the end of the show. So time is not on my side, and there is a decent chance that we will want for Willoughby. Good alternate title for this week's session. It's a little hard to predict exactly how swiftly we will navigate these chapters, because I think it is fair to say that this is the part of the book that begins to lose its focus a little bit, begins to lose its tension just a little bit. There is a tightness to the plotting in the first, 4/5 of the book, I guess, that feels more intentional, that feels more careful, that feels as though we are constructing something with more deliberation. And here at the beginning of the third volume, that kind of falls away. In exchange, we get some of the best character writing that I think that we get from Austen in all of her works. Her command of voice and of character is perhaps never stronger and never more clearly demonstrated than it is in this week's reading, as we move from, Mrs. Jennings to Miss Steele to Colonel Brandon to Edward to John to Robert, with all of these distinct voices who are so clear in their characterization. I think it's sparkling, but the price that we pay for that is losing a little tension in that core plot. So we're going to see how we progress, and whatever is left over, just to put this out there right now, whatever is left over we will cover next week back, or I guess later this week back in our regular Thursday slot. So we will conclude Sense and Sensibility on Thursday, no matter how much we have left to read. Let's begin, though, with chapter 37, with some shifts in the status quo. Mrs. Jennings, fresh from tending to her daughter, descends upon Eleanor with all of the gossip about Edward and Lucy and the news, gasp, of their engagement. Let's take a look at our first slide. Well, and so this was kept a great secret for fear of Mrs. Ferrars, and neither she nor your brother or sister suspected a word of the matter till this very morning. Poor Nancy, who you know is a well-meaning creature but no conjurer, popped it all out. Lord, thinks she to herself, they are all so fond of Lucy, to be sure they will make no difficulty about it. And so away she went to your sister, who was sitting all alone at her carpet work, little suspecting what was to come, for she had just been saying to your brother only 5 minutes before that she thought to make a match between Edward and some lord's daughter or other, I forget who. So you may think what a blow it was to all her vanity and pride. She fell into violent hysterics immediately, with such screams as reached your brother's ears, as he was sitting in his own dressing room downstairs thinking about writing a letter to his steward in the country. So up he flew directly, and a terrible scene took place, for Lucy was come to them by that time, little dreaming what was going on. Poor soul, I pity her. And I must say, I think she was used very hardly, for your sister scolded like any fury, and soon drove her into a fainting fit. Nancy, she fell upon her knees and cried bitterly, and your brother, he walked about the room, and said he did not know what to do. Mrs. Dashwood declared that they should not stay a minute longer in the house, and your brother was forced to go down upon his knees too, to persuade her to let them stay till they had packed up their clothes. Again, so much voice contained in here, folded into the narrative voice of Mrs. Jennings, who just takes over the proceedings here. It is, of course, a strange choice to have this scene occur off page, to have it occur without the presence of ostensibly our two POV characters, although that becomes extremely loose as we move through the beginning of this volume, as Mrs. Jennings becomes a kind of de facto third protagonist of this book, just in terms of that audience perspective, that reader perspective. There's so much here. We could honestly spend a healthy 20 minutes just, I think, looking at this brilliant set of dynamics and the way that Mrs. Jennings is giving us this perspective on these characters who are so familiar to us, but also kind of enfolding her own commentary. Perhaps my favorite is the note about John being downstairs in his drawing room, thinking about writing a letter to his steward. Not writing a letter to his steward, but thinking about writing a letter to his steward. Just really, really lovely. There is, of course, potential, at least, for some confusion about the names here. The sister to whom Mrs. Jennings is referring is, of course, Fanny, not Marianne. And Mrs. Dashwood, also not Eleanor and Marianne's mother, Mrs. Dashwood, but John's wife, Fanny, again there. The other person, I suppose, who pops into the narrative here, all unannounced, is Nancy. Nancy, to clarify, is Anne Steele, the elder Miss Steele, Lucy's elder sister. The name Nancy first comes into English as the name Ancy, A-N-C-Y, which is a diminutive of Agnes or Annis. This happens in the 15th, early 16th centuries. The name comes in as a kind of, as a shortened form, as a nickname, right? We also add that extra diminutive E ending on the and, right? So we contract Agnes or Annis to Ants, E. We add the diminutive there. But there is this common process in English linguistics in particular, which is to say it is a process in linguistics, but it is particularly common in English, called rebracketing. And this is particularly common in English when we are dealing with the letter N at the beginning of nouns, because it's very tempting over time to change a nouns into an nouns. This has happened. The most notable example, I'm sure, is the garment that one wears when one is baking was traditionally known as a napron, and over time was rebracketed into an apron, right? The N kind of moves from the noun itself to the preceding word there. So that's a very common feature, and it happens here with Nancy, right? It happens more interestingly, more specifically, I suppose, because obviously we would never say a Nancy, right? Or an Nancy, but the prefix there would be mine own, right? To indicate someone that you know. So it went from being mine Nancy to my Nancy. And that is how we arrive at the modern name, Nancy. The same process happens with Anne as well, of course, right? Over time, mine Anne becomes my Nan. That is the origin of that. And also the diminutive can be attached there too. So that is how we get from Anne to Nancy in Mrs. Jennings' account. And of course, Mrs. Jennings is being really quite presumptuous. Even given their relationship, I think that it is quite presumptuous to speak to a third party using this extremely informal nickname here. She's demonstrating how close she is to Miss Steele, and in so doing, I think, kind of aligning herself with what she perceives to be decorum and dignity and goodness here, right? One of these aggrieved parties is in the right, and the other is Mrs. Dashwood, right? The other is Fanny Dashwood. As we see here, where, yes, what a blow it was to all her vanity and pride. She fell into violent hysterics immediately. You can see the overreaction here because she's thinking about marrying Edward off. And what we're really seeing here, of course, the reason I think that Mrs. Jennings is relating this story to Eleanor, it's not just gossip, though. It certainly is, right? Mrs. Jennings is a character who loves to demonstrate how much she knows, how familiar she is with the goings-on around town. But what she's also conveying here to Eleanor is, well, something of justice, right? Because we've seen previously Fanny taking up the Steele sisters as a kind of project to demonstrate how little favor she has for Eleanor. That is an idea that's going to come back around to us when we get to John later in this week's reading. But right now, in this moment, it turns out that this plot, this little bit of social engineering, has backfired on Fanny Dashwood quite remarkably. And now the secret is out. As I say, odd that we don't see it in person, but understandable, I suppose, because one of the things that Austen is doing through this week's reading that I think accounts for a little of that bagginess that I described at the beginning of the episode. One of the reasons that we end up in this situation is that she is still rendering the story in a very naturalistic tone. We are still kind of observing the formalities of who would go where and why and with whom, right? How do we get all of this information to come out? Well, perhaps Miss Steele, right, would have been less forthcoming if there had been guests in the room. Frankly, if Eleanor and Marianne, or even just Eleanor by herself, had been there, she presumably would not have thought to tell Fanny while she is at her carpet work, right, while she is embroidering, about this secret engagement that's been on so long. So I think that Austen is allowing here the reality, the naturalism of Regency England and these particular kind of social interactions, these particularly ordered and formal social interactions, to restrict in some senses the movement of the plot, the flow of the plot, which is of course very particularly relevant to Eleanor's character, as we will see, in fact, as we move forward. Rachel's saying in the chat, I love Austen's dramatic family scenes. Basically, no one has ever done it better, I think, right? I think that Austen just shows up, defines the form, perfects the form, and then sadly is just taken from us with far too slender a body of work, unfortunately. But a really great, and you're right, just it's so charming, it's so fast. And honestly, if I had to make a choice whether I wanted a tighter plot or I wanted all this voice here in the third volume of Sense and Sensibility, I would probably choose the voice. I think the voice is just spectacular. And this isn't even my favorite one. That's what's so great about it. There's just such an abundance. So, in any case, the news of Edward and Lucy's long engagement is now public. It leads to exactly the kind of meltdown and retribution that one might expect. Edward is effectively disinherited by his mother immediately. The wealth of that family going to his younger brother Robert, and he decides to take orders, to be ordained in the church, which is, of course, the career path that he wanted for himself anyway. That is a thing that he wanted to undertake, but couldn't because of the restrictions of his position as inheritor, right, as heir to the family fortune. But now, liberated from that burden, he can kind of do what he wants. But we have to acknowledge, too, that it might take some time before he can find a position and marry Lucy. And again, that minor plot, as we're moving forward, is also very stop-start. It feels as though we make progress on that plot and then slow down again, or even take some steps back, only to be accelerated again by some minor revision to the story. It feels a little jagged in terms of our progression toward the end of the story and our final, of course, outcome. It is an interesting strategy. I really like having these stories unfold outside of the POV of Eleanor and Marianne. Marianne, I think we are barely going to talk about, at least until we get into Somerset, right? We're really not going to have much opportunity to talk about her while we're still in London. But Eleanor is holding down the fort as a mediator of these different stories, these different narrative threads, these different impulses, these different agendas, certainly, as we're moving through this process. And she is relegated kind of to a sounding board for the rest of the cast of this book, right? Not our focal cast, but the cast that is off in the periphery. And I'm saying, of course, that we're not going to get much Marianne. We're going to dispense first with Marianne and Eleanor's emotional reconnection here. The first real acknowledgement that Eleanor has been suffering this whole time, and that perhaps Eleanor is not the most reliable narrator. Let's get into our revelation here about how long Eleanor has been keeping the secret and what it has done to her, what it has cost her, this knowledge. 4 months! Have you known of this 4 months? Eleanor confirmed it. What? While attending me in all my misery, has this been on your heart, and I have reproached you for being happy? It was not fit that you should know how much I was the reverse, excuse me. 4 months, cried Marianne again. So calm, so cheerful. How have you been supported? By feeling that I was doing my duty. My promise to Lucy obliged me to be secret. I owed it to her, therefore, to avoid giving any hint of the truth, and I owed it to my family and friends not to create in them a solicitude about me, which it could not be in my power to satisfy. Marianne seemed much struck. I have very often wished to undeceive yourself and my mother, added Eleanor, and once or twice I have attempted it, but without betraying my trust I could never have convinced you. 4 months! And yet you loved him! Yes, but I do not love only him, and while the comfort of others was dear to me, I was glad to spare them from knowing how much I felt. Now I can think and speak of it with little emotion. I would not have you suffer on my account, for I assure you, I no longer suffer materially myself. So, as we know, of course, but as we have been somewhat distanced from, Eleanor has been carrying this secret in her heart for these 4 months, and because she wanted to honor the secret, because she wanted to protect Lucy, because she wanted to keep this confidence in which she had been kind of almost unwillingly thrust, because she wanted to do the right thing, she couldn't manifest the signs of sadness, of heart sickness, because that would engender within her family a certain solicitude, right? They would be worried about her. They would be caring for her. And she could offer them then no explanation. She could not say, yeah, I'm just a little down because of, no reason. No reason at all. Definitely not a secret engagement. And we cannot encompass that, right? From Marianne's perspective here, we cannot understand exactly how that plays out, because Marianne, of course, is not just so moved by the immensity, the enormity of her feelings that she demonstrates them constantly, but also, as we've discussed before, the demonstration of feeling to Marianne is a kind of a means of demonstrating one's own authenticity, right? A means of demonstrating one's own integrity of spirit. You feel these things enormously, and it is good to feel these things enormously. Thus, you demonstrate that you feel these things enormously. You do not enfold them within you and deal with them yourself very quietly in order to preserve this decorum, this decency, to maintain the secret that you have undertaken. And I love, again, we're going to spend a lot of time this week just talking about the voice, but this repetition of 4 months. 4 months, have you known this 4 months? 4 months, cried Marianne again. Just apparently this coming over her in waves, right? You can kind of feel her just returning to this idea. It is not that Edward and Lucy have been engaged these 4 years. It is not even necessarily that Eleanor has been carrying the secret, but it's that she has been carrying the secret with no outward sign for so long. And it speaks to Eleanor's sense, right? Her decency, her desire to be formal and to be proper, that there has been no sign of it. But again, this is where we hit the clash of Sense and Sensibility, where we hit the clash of Eleanor's reserve and Marianne's excess. This is where we find it very difficult to reconcile these two sisters, the one with the other. Though you'll note that there is no false conflict. There's no injection here of a friction between the sisters that we would not really believe, I think, right? Marianne at no point says, "You lied to me. You didn't even tell me the truth. I'm your sister. How could you not tell me?" Her genuine care here is for her sister. She does not interpose herself into the narrative, which I've been thinking about so much over the course of the last week, because there is so little of it in Austen's work, and there's so little of it in work of the period. It feels... I want to hesitate before I say a very modern phenomenon, as though I am diagnosing an ill in society, though certainly I think you could take this argument that far. You would be supported, certainly, in taking the argument that far. But there is this idea, I think, that in modern storytelling, because we want everyone to be the hero of their own story, which is generally, narratively speaking, kind of bad and thin advice, but because that is such a part of contemporary narrative, we allow people to interpose themselves into stories that really have nothing to do with them, right? Marianne understands that this story has nothing to do with her. This is not a plot in which she is embroiled. Instead, she can just be present for her sister in a way that allows much more emotional transparency, right? We're still demonstrating who Marianne is in practice, in action, right? But we're not necessarily feeling the need to generate more false conflict. Let's move into the second half of this encounter, and then we'll leave Marianne behind for much of the rest of this week's episode. This is Eleanor persuading Marianne to contain herself. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "you have made me hate myself forever. How barbarous have I been to you, you who have been my only comfort, who have borne with me in all my misery, who have seemed to be only suffering for me. Is this my gratitude? Is this the only return I can make you? Because your merit cries out upon myself, I have been trying to do it away." The tenderest caresses followed this confession. In such a frame of mind as she was now in, Eleanor had no difficulty in obtaining from her whatever promise she required, and at her request, Marianne engaged never to speak of the affair to anyone with the least appearance of bitterness, to meet Lucy without betraying the smallest increase of dislike to her, and even to see Edward himself, if chance should bring them together, without any diminution good Lord, stumbling over diminution of her usual cordiality. These were great concessions, but where Marianne felt that she had injured, no reparation could be too much for her to make. She performed her promise of being discreet to admiration. She attended to all that Mrs. Jennings had to say upon the subject with an unchanging complexion, dissented from her in nothing, and was heard 3 times to say, "Yes, Ma'am." She listened to her praise of Lucy with only moving from one chair to the other, and when Mrs. Jennings talked of Edward's affection, it cost her only a spasm in her throat. Such advances toward heroism in her sister made Eleanor feel equal to anything herself. The heroism, I think, is exactly right. This is Marianne, because she is feeling so indebted to her sister, because she is feeling so barbarous, right? So monstrous, because Eleanor has been demonstrating this kindness and this care for Marianne in her grief, right? In her heartbreak, and Marianne has been unconscious of her sister's suffering all the same while. She now is able to contain herself, to literally, behave in the way that Eleanor wishes her to behave, which is not entirely natural to Marianne, and also not entirely virtuous. It is decent. It is polite. It is good. Skeep is saying here in the chat, Marianne channeling her theater kid energy for the greater good. Isn't that fantastic? It's not just that she leans into it. It's that we get this very precise, she's heard 3 times to say, yes, mom, right? You can't imagine Marianne being so simple and so obedient, so submissive to Mrs. Jennings in these things. She listened to the praise of Lucy, only moving one chair to another. That's all. She had to get it out. She had to move her body, but she just had to move across the room. And then a spasm in her throat when the talk turns to Edward. It is really, really beautiful, I think. And again, right, another indication that neither of these characters is as thin as we might expect them to be. Neither of these characters is as simple or as reduced as we might expect them to be. Marianne is capable here of being selfless. And selflessness is such an important quality in Austen's work, but such an underrepresented quality, right? Because we usually demonstrate the importance of selflessness by having selfish characters. We're going to talk a little about Lucy in just a little while. So, moving on, we then get the visit from John, who just continues to be the worst, and who outlines what has happened to Edward in terms of his mother's disapproval, right? We get this other perspective, which is all the more searing and condemnatory than Mrs. Jennings' first account. So Edward has been disinherited in favor of the odious Robert, and his mother will personally intervene to make Edward's advancement in his chosen career as difficult as possible, just out of petty vengeance, right? There's no advantage to her at this point. Mrs. Ferrers having disinherited Edward, having bestowed, the exact mechanics of which aren't entirely clear, right? Because Edward has arguably a legal right to contest this process of disinheritance, or at least would be able to go after Robert upon the death of his mother and the passing of that inheritance on to the younger son. He might have a legal right to pursue reparation in court, but of course Edward is just not that guy. He's not going to take that kind of route. All of this occurs narratively for 2 reasons. The first is that we resolve the secret plot while, setting up the rest of the story. We kind of take this out of the way and so liberate all of our characters in terms of the plot progression so they can continue to move forward, so we can move toward a resolution for this story, in effect, right? But the second and arguably much more important aspect of this reveal and the consequences of this reveal is that Edward comes out clean. He comes out without the stain of dishonor, without the stain of dishonesty. He comes out preserved in his character, his decency, his civility. Edward really doesn't put a foot wrong. Well, maybe we might argue his repeated trips to see Eleanor, both in the countryside, right? Back when she is out in the countryside and here in town, we don't get any idea that Edward has been that Edward visits Lucy at all in town, even when he visits Eleanor again. But in all of this, even in this adversity, he maintains his commitment to Lucy. He proves himself to be a gentleman. He proves himself to be an appropriate match. He is not stained by this long engagement, this long secret. We get this line at the beginning of the next chapter, kind of really beautifully balancing our sisters again in terms of their response to Edward. Quote, Eleanor gloried in his integrity, and Marianne forgave all his offenses in compassion for his punishment. He is just this noble figure, this genuinely good dude, and because he is genuinely good, whatever sins he has committed, whatever transgressions have occurred, can be forgiven. Because Eleanor sees his integrity, sees his decency, and responds to that, and because Marianne sees the injustice of his punishment and responds to that. These two sisters kind of approaching the same problem from opposite sides, but coming to the same conclusion nonetheless. It is important, I think, and should be emphasized that sense and sensibility, right? These two approaches to life, which we have seen develop so fully through the course of the novel, these are both, in their way, effective moral frameworks as well as personal inclinations. They're not just means of interacting with the world around you, but they dictate what you hold to be important, what you hold to be true, what you hold certainly to be virtuous. And what is important is that they are both effective. They are most effective when combined, right? They are most effective in a kind of unity, but neither one is more dissolute. Neither one is more prone to vice than the other. There's no sense, as I feel there would be if this were a modern novel with exactly the same setup, there's no sense that Marianne is a bad girl and Eleanor is the good girl, right? That would be the very traditional way of setting this up. If you're doing the Disney Channel original movie version of Sense and Sensibility, that is kind of where you would begin, but there's no continuity of that thought here in the text. I think that we very carefully present both Sense and Sensibility, not just as being personal compasses, right? Not just as being personal inclinations, personal approaches to the world, but also as being kind of moral philosophies that are complete in and of themselves, but which do, it must be acknowledged, function more strongly when we are combining them. So let's move on. When I'm talking about voice in this week's reading, let me put the slide up here so that we can enjoy moving on to Anne and the account that Anne gives to Eleanor. We get the whole story again, kind of effectively getting the whole story for a third time, right? Which is, again, we're sensing some of this looseness in our plot progression, but we're also getting so much brilliant voice. This is not, I think it's fair to say, if not completely defensible, that this is not entirely the Anne that we see in the rest of the book, right? It feels as though Anne is more developed here. And perhaps she simply is because she's more comfortable and confident with Lucy. But I do sense a shift in the characterization just a little bit. But this version of the character is so good that I really can't object to it. So this is toward the end of the story after we have learned how it is that Miss Steele has come by all of this information. I do not understand what you mean by interrupting them, said Eleanor. You were all in the same room together, were you not? No, indeed, not us. Law, Miss Dashwood, you must think people make love when anybody else is by. Oh, for shame! To be sure, you must know better than that. Laughing affectedly. No, they were shut up in the drawing room together, and all I heard was only by listening at the door. How? Cried Eleanor. Have you been repeating to me what you only learnt yourself by listening at the door? I am sorry I did not know it before, for I certainly would not have suffered you to give me particulars of a conversation which you ought not to have known yourself. How could you behave so unfairly by your sister? Oh, law, there's nothing in that. I only stood at the door and heard what I could. And I'm sure Lucy would have done just the same by me. For a year or two back, when Martha Sharp and I had so many secrets together, she never made any bones of hiding in a closet or behind a chimney board on purpose to hear what we said. The scandal. This whole sequence with Anne, I think, is possibly the best exercise in comedic writing in the entire book because of the handle on this voice. It is all so specific and simultaneously oblivious. It is just perfect and beautifully realized, again, right, in terms of that moral framework that we were just discussing. Edward, despite everything, has been confirmed as a good man. In this confession of scandalous eavesdropping, Miss Steele reveals herself, and Lucy too, right, to be lacking in social grace. This is a real turning point. We have suspected this before, but I think that we did not know how far it went. The chimney board, or more commonly fireboard, by the way, is just a wooden board, as the name might suggest, oftentimes painted with flowers or with images of a rural landscape. It is placed in front of the fireplace during the summer when the fire is not in use. Just a little ornamental affect that stops the wind from blowing down the chimney, even in those warmer English summers. So Austen is emphasizing here, right, that beyond Anne's casual descriptions of eavesdropping, this isn't just standing outside the door. This isn't just loitering on the corner. This isn't just listening in at a window. She is at the door actively listening, and then gives this account of hiding in a fireplace, all right, of Lucy concealing herself in a fireplace behind the board in order to overhear these otherwise intimate conversations. So this goes beyond casual eavesdropping into the realm of some real espionage. And of course, because I am me, I cannot think of anything but, as you'll see from the title of this week's session, I can't think of anything but Sam Gamgee when I'm thinking about eavesdropping. I ain't been dropping no eaves, sir, honest. We conclude the chapter with a letter from Lucy, who, again, the purpose of the scene with Anne is to begin to either sour our opinions of the Steele sisters, or if we are already soured in our opinions of the Steele sisters, as I myself find myself to be at this moment, it solidifies our verdict on their conduct, their behavior, their manners, their decency, because this letter from Lucy simultaneously wins all of the affection of Mrs. Jennings because she is so lavish in her praise, because she can, as Mrs. Jennings says, despite her lack of literacy, she can turn a pretty enough phrase. It's not a particularly poorly written letter. There's enough there, but really it's the outrageous flattery toward Mrs. Jennings that secures her positivity. But we can see already some of this selfishness, some of the self-regard from Lucy. This is going to come back to us later. We get this. That it turns out, facing relative poverty, she offered Edward a chance to escape the engagement, and he did not take it, further confirming his essential goodness and decency. He is a man of his word. He will keep his engagement. So therefore, Lucy writes to ask Eleanor and Mrs. Jennings in the hope that they can find Edward a position. So all of this flattery, all of this civility, all of this decency, all of this courtesy that is performed by Lucy in this moment underpins her more basic desire, which is, please help Edward find a job so that we can get married, right? It is a means of rather selfishly using the people of your acquaintance in order to accomplish your goals. Skeep is saying in the chat here, Edward probably believes himself deserving of whatever his mum dies because he failed her, whatever he gets upon his inheritance because he failed her. It is interesting that we don't get a strong perspective at this point in the text on how Edward feels about his family. It's just, Rachel calling out Lucy just being the worst. It is such a brilliant, I'm thinking role, right? The word that I want to use is role because I'm thinking about the adaptations that we see here. But it is such a brilliant piece of characterization that she is introduced as, with such potential friction, such potential sources of conflict. And then that is softened so immediately because she seems fairly harmless and charming. And now we see that harmless, charming quality is a shield for a deeper and more sour self-regard, right? She is fundamentally a selfish person, and that would be bad enough. But when we're seeing this coupled narratively with Eleanor's selflessness and with Marianne's selflessness, and we get to see, thanks to the presence of Mrs. Jennings in the story at this point, exactly how Lucy's manipulations work on those people who are more inclined to receive them. I think it's a really fantastic piece of work. But through all of this too, right, we still maintain a level of complexity with Lucy that I think is even going to fall out of some of Austen's writings in later books, and certainly would fall out of this story were told by a less skilled novelist. Let's push on and get to our next chapter, which begins with the realization that the Miss Dashwoods have been in London for 2 months. And that is now coming to an end. It's the middle of March. We plan to go to Cleveland, the Palmer's estate in Somerset, the county northeast of Devonshire. So really on the route back home to Barton. The problem, of course, is that Cleveland is only 30 miles from Combe Magna, Willoughby's small, somewhat isolated estate, but still, Willoughby. I don't remember if I mentioned this before. Combe Magna is a combination. It means great valley or large valley. It's a combination of Latin magna, right, just meaning large or impressive. The word magnificent is derived from that. Combe is derived from the Old English word, which is in turn derived from the Celtic word combe, meaning valley. That word exists still today in Welsh. If you ever see the Welsh word combe, C-W-M, that word also means valley and is still, as I say, in use. Today, we get the fantastic scene of Colonel Brandon conversing with Eleanor while we remain in Mrs. Jennings' POV, trying to discern the content of their conversation while towing the line of what is considered appropriate eavesdropping, right? It is so great to get this account from Anne of eavesdropping on the previous conversations, to have Lucy be so scandalized, and then to kind of cut into the POV of Mrs. Jennings so that she can, not eavesdrop. Let us be clear. She is not crossing the lines of social decorum here, but she is aware of the discussion and kind of wants to know what is happening, but still remains on the right side. We even have her moving away from Eleanor and Brandon, getting closer to Marianne's pianoforte so that she doesn't accidentally overhear, but if there is an opportunity where she accidentally overhears, she will absorb that information, as we will see. We then get a very modern literary trick, quite frankly. We get the intrusion of the narrative voice into the text itself, and we rewind to the beginning of this conversation so that we can see exactly what was being discussed between Eleanor and Brandon. What had really passed between them was to this effect. "I have heard," said he, with great compassion, "of the injustice your friend Mr. Ferrars has suffered from his family. For, if I understand the matter right, he has been entirely cast off by them for preserving his engagement with a very deserving young woman. Have I been rightly informed? Is it so?" Eleanor told him that it was. "The cruelty," The impolitic cruelty, he replied with great feeling, of dividing or attempting to divide two young people long attached to each other is terrible. Mrs. Ferrars does not know what she may be doing, what she may drive her son to. I have seen Mr. Ferrars 2 or 3 times in Harley Street, and am much pleased with him. He is not a young man with whom one can be intimately acquainted in a short time, but I have seen enough of him to wish him well for his own sake, and as a friend of yours I wish it still more. I understand that he intends to take orders. Will you be so good as to tell him that the living of Delaford, now just vacant, as I am informed by this day's post, is his, if you think it worth his acceptance, but that perhaps, so unfortunately circumstanced as he is now, it may be nonsense to appear to doubt. I only wish it were more valuable. It is a rectory, but a small one. The late incumbent, I believe, did not make more than £200 per annum, and I thought it certainly capable of improvement. I fear not to such an amount as to afford him a very comfortable income. Such as it is, however, my pleasure in presenting him to it will be very great. Pray assure him of it. Excellency here, just from Brandon, right? Just very strong. And again, we're seeing in Brandon, it's so beautiful how this is pulled out. We're kind of getting the inverse of the Lizzie Darcy relationship here, right? Where she is the only one who sees him as he really is. Instead, what we're getting is Brandon is proving himself again and again to be a perfect match for Marianne, right? He is demonstrating all of this sensibility. He's demonstrating all this deep well of feeling, his belief in love, his sense of decency, and his willingness to speak on the subject of decency, right? His willingness to alienate Mrs. Ferrars by reaching out to Edward and giving him this opportunity. It is really beautifully balanced, although there is, of course, this catch that we get to in just a moment, right? That as it is, as Brandon lays out here, it only makes £200 a year, and obviously, Edward is welcome to it, and maybe it can grow a little bit, but it's not going to grow that much more. But obviously that will be too little for Edward to live with a wife and a family. He's offering Edward security as a bachelor at this point, but it will be insufficient to marry. But we still get, all this generosity, his desire to help, his belief in the importance of love. Skipa's saying in the chat, it's interesting to me how Austen treats different women who are striving to rise up the social order. Emma takes a girl in hand to elevate her. Fanny and Mansfield Park's whole story is one of elevation. But with Lucy, the exercise of striving seems to be treated like a real negative. I do see what you're saying. And I would also observe that one of the things that makes Austen so interesting is that there is, I think, a modulation in the moral landscape of each of these books, right? I'm not sure that Austen presents for us a singular set of virtues that we can apply to every character in every situation. I think that Emma in particular is a little bit more textured in terms of her goodness, right? And how she applies that goodness. The problem here isn't, I think, with Lucy seeking to advance herself in the world, right? You'll remember that we had this discussion about Eleanor feeling sorry for her that she didn't receive more education, that she is, well, and balancing that with this observation that she is illiterate. It doesn't mean, as I said before, that Lucy is actually illiterate. It means that she chooses not to read. She can, she doesn't. And that is more worthy of judgment, because what Lucy wants is for things to be provided for her. That is what becomes clear as we're moving through this part of the text. She is less willing to do the work herself. She will conduct herself superficially and selfishly in society in order to get what she wants. And that is not something that Eleanor is willing to sign off on, basically, or that any of our quote-unquote good characters are willing to sign off on. Though ultimately, of course, Lucy will get what she wants. Lucy will turn out much better than anyone could have expected at the beginning of the novel, even if we had known her secrets back then. So it's not entirely the case that she is, judged and found wanting, though Robert is certainly genuinely awful. It is about the selfishness that she displays as she is moving forward. But still, not a truly reprehensible character, perhaps, right? She has the shield of her need, right? In terms of that moral compass, she is motivated by something approaching necessity, and the provision too for her sister, who we never really talk about in terms of her possibilities of beneficial match. But yeah, it's pretty big. Yeah, Skeep is saying, Austen isn't giving any big moral lessons. All women should know their place or anything like that. Each case is different, and I think it's a real gift to be able to put each situation in its own context. I completely agree, Skeepa. Austen, generally, extremely feminist, right? There's been this ongoing discourse. There is an ongoing discourse, and it is, not here in 2025 getting any easier. But there is an ongoing discourse about Austen as a feminist because she comes in interested in the stories of women, interested in the pursuits of women, interested in the way in which women interact with the world. But because of her situation, because of her very specific context as an author, she isn't calling a lot of explicit attention to the difficulties faced by women in her world, right? Whether we're talking about her very specific career as a writer, that very short-lived career as a writer, or her lifespan in general, right? Moving from the Georgian period into, the Regency on the cusp of the Victorian period. What we see from her is a lot of feminism by inclination. I say it all the time, particularly over on the Shire Reckoning, my Tolkien podcast, that writers betray their ideology all the time because ideology is subconscious, because ideology is what you secretly believe in your heart, because you never think to question it, right? You never think to study these beliefs that lay like icebergs mostly under the surface. And any writer all the time betrays what they really think and believe. People tell you who they are. I am telling you who I am through the means of this podcast, right? I demonstrate in 100 ways every episode these assumptions that I make about the world, the ideology that I carry in my heart. And Austen does the same thing. So while she is not calling out explicit, cri de coeur of the feminist cause in the Regency period, she is demonstrating over and over how women are oppressed, how women conduct themselves with regard to other women. There are few men in all of Austen's work that are as cruel or as dangerous as some of the women, right? We can see that right here in this book with the very careful and specific positioning of Mrs. Ferrers. It is important that it is Edward's mother and not Edward's father. It would be a very different story if Mr. Ferrers was the one who was juggling the matrimonial concerns of his family. We're instead seeing how women are victims of and made weapons by the society that they inhabit. And I find that fascinating. So we move through this ongoing feminist discourse with Austen. Is she feminist? Is she insufficiently feminist? Is she, in fact, secretly kind of tradwifey and kind of deeply conservative about how women operate in this world? Is she concerned with class? Is she concerned with race? Is she concerned with opportunity for advancement? Is she concerned with education? Some of these have very trivial answers. Some of them not so much. And some of them, of course, are coming from a relatively privileged position, albeit it's the privilege of a woman in the Regency period. So it's not that much privilege, by modern standards, but there are things that Austen just didn't have to think about in her life because of her own set of personal circumstances. So I do find Austen to be a very feminist author. I find Austen to be deeply and profoundly interested in the complexities of women at a time when that was not popular, at a time when that was not easy, at a time when that was not particularly commercial, right? And has not become substantially more commercial or easy in the 2 centuries since. I think that is one of the reasons that Austen remains so vibrant and so relevant for us today. I'm aware that I'm approaching, wrapping up our entire Austen series here. I was going to talk about this next week when we got to the end of the book, but I think that we really do see this authentic concern and care for the feminist experience, for the feminine experience, and for the role of women in that society, and the ways overt and covert, the ways explicit and implicit by which women are subjugated by the society in which they find themselves, the ways in which those challenges can be met, the ways in which those challenges just have to be accepted, and the ways in which those challenges aren't even always acknowledged as challenges because you're in the water as it's boiling, and it's not always easy to see the temperature change. Let's thank you, Skipa, for the invitation to talk at length about that. That was, I love Austen, and my appreciation for her, I think, has honestly never been higher than delving so deeply into this book. We will definitely, I think, be coming back to Austen August next year. I would, as I've said, I've read Emma with some care. I read Mansfield Park not with as much care as I should, and I've basically never read Northanger Abbey with any kind of insight. So I would love to go back and kind of close out and see what else there is out there. Let's keep going because we have to get back to the, as I'm talking about the plot here lacking a certain substance. we do this very nice kind of classic, almost a sitcom setup, right? Where you have Mrs. Jennings listening in to Eleanor and Brandon as Marianne is playing the pianoforte. And she's not getting the whole story, but she's getting these snatches of dialogue that lead her to believe, well, as is so often the case in this book, they lead her to believe the thing that she secretly wants to believe all along, which is that Eleanor and Brandon are now engaged. So we then rewind, right? The narrative voice intrudes, rewinds us back to the beginning of that sequence, and we get the account that we were just discussing, exactly the offer that Colonel Brandon is making to Edward, and Eleanor's kind of role here in the periphery of that, right? Her sympathy for Edward as we're establishing, you know, the gentle-heartedness of these two characters. We then have Mrs. Jennings leaving, believing. We get this little short comic interlude where she and Eleanor are talking at cross purposes, and Eleanor is describing the situation with Edward, believing that Mrs. Jennings knows that this is the discussion that she had with Brandon, and Mrs. Jennings believes that Eleanor and Brandon are on the verge of announcing their engagement, and we get this little weird two-step where she has to believe for a moment that what they are waiting on, at least in part, is for Edward to be ordained so that he can perform the wedding ceremony, and Mrs. Jennings then goes off into the world. And everything that we know about narrative, every TV show we've ever watched, every novel we've ever read, tells us that this is happening so that Mrs. Jennings can go off and say the wrong thing to the wrong person and spark some conflict, spark some misunderstanding, trigger the last sequence of events, right? Start that last row of dominoes falling so that we can get to the end of the plot. She's putting a torch to the dry tinder of the story as it's being presented here. Which would be completely appropriate, honestly, given the positioning of Mrs. Jennings as a gossip and gossip as a social ill in terms of this book, right? It would be a completely appropriate way of concluding the story. This does not happen. We just bring Mrs. Jennings back in. We have this scene where they explain the misunderstanding to one another and laugh about it, and then we move on with the plot. We don't need this odd distraction for all that it is entertaining in the moment. So we end up with kind of three versions of the same scene all playing out. There's a great deal of repetition in this part of the book. In any case, we then get Eleanor beginning to write to Edward. I'm talking about Mrs. Jennings leaving now, of course. Eleanor sits down to write to Edward, only for the man himself to appear at the door. And we work through the details of Brandon's proposal, again with Eleanor deflecting Edward's thanks because she doesn't want to accept them for herself. She doesn't want to accept her own role in securing his future, in effect. I did want to call out a little point of clarification here because we've previously discussed the scandalous intimacy of a young man and a young woman engaging in correspondence. Here, though, we're walking a very fine line, specifically with Eleanor and Edward, because they are family, in effect, right? That is why it is not scandalous. They have a familial connection, which is simultaneously close enough that no one would blink twice at them sending letters to one another, but not so close that we feel icky about them getting together at the end of the book. You know what I mean, right? And we're actually very close to that because, of course, through the Regency period, it isn't illegal to marry if you are, given the very few number of divorces which go through in this period, the circumstances are almost always, you know, circumstances of widowhood or widowerhood. If you are deprived by death of your spouse, you are not allowed. Shortly after this period, there is a law passed saying that you are not allowed to marry the brother or sister of your spouse. You're not allowed to marry your brother-in-law in the absence of your husband, or marry your sister-in-law in the absence of your wife. That is legally enshrined in the early Victorian period. But even in the Regency period, it was frowned upon. It was a voidable circumstance. So if a judge discovered that you had, in fact, if you as a bright young thing, you know, your husband goes off and tragically dies, and so you marry your brother-in-law, if a judge finds out that that is the case, that marriage can be annulled immediately with no recourse or appeal. So that I mentioned this to demonstrate the taboo at the time of being too close to your intermarried family, to your in-laws, in effect. And there are parts of the world, even today, where technically by convention, I suppose, Eleanor and Edward would be in-laws, right? it would be appropriate in some parts of the world, not I think most of the United States, or indeed in Scotland, which is the other place that I can speak of with some authority, but there are parts of the world where it would be appropriate to consider, even at this point in the story, Edward to be Eleanor's brother-in-law, right? By proxy, the brother-in-law of her half-brother would still kind of filter out to be her brother-in-law and would make marriages illegal, unacceptable, certainly socially taboo. So it's interesting that we managed to position ourselves so carefully, but almost incidentally. At no point does a character sit down with a family tree and a flowchart and say, okay, is this completely okay for this relationship to take place? And this is, pretty transparent, but it's another example of the care with which Austen writes. She's orchestrated this actually very carefully. They are exactly close enough that they can have the relationship that they have, and exactly far enough apart that they can have the relationship that they have. They managed to situate these two characters very carefully, the one with the other. In any case, Edward is here, and we're going to cut to the end of their discussion as he gets ready to leave, moved, stirred by the kindness of Colonel Brandon. Let me call up this slide here. Colonel Brandon, I think, lodges in St. James's Street, said he, soon afterwards rising from his chair. Eleanor told him the number of the house. I must hurry away, then, to give him those thanks which you will not allow me to give you, to assure him that he has made me an exceedingly happy man. Eleanor did not offer to detain him, and they parted with a very earnest assurance on her side of her unceasing good wishes for his happiness in every change of situation that might befall him. On his, with rather an attempt to return the same goodwill than the power of expressing it. When I see him again, said Eleanor to herself as the door shut him out, I shall see him the husband of Lucy. And with this pleasing anticipation, she sat down to reconsider the past, recall the words, and endeavour to comprehend all the feelings of Edward, and, of course, to reflect on her own with discontent. And it's subtle, it's beautifully subtle here, but we're allowed an insight into Eleanor's emotional state vis-a-vis Edward and Lucy. She's allowed to feel, incompletely happy, right? She had, with this pleasing anticipation, she sat down to reconsider the past, recall her words, and endeavor to comprehend all the feelings of Edward, right? I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to sort this out. What have I said to him? What has he said to me? How has he been feeling this whole time? Did I imagine that there was a spark between us even though he was already engaged? Why does he come to visit me? It would seem more often than he ever goes to visit Lucy. And of course, to reflect on her own with discontent, to consider her own feelings and to acknowledge the unhappiness of them. And I'm struck by admiration at how Austen is willing even to engage in this kind of duality, to have Eleanor be actually authentically pleased for Edward and Lucy, but also to experience her own feelings of discontentment, of disappointment, of loneliness. She is both a good person and a real person in the way that these are presented. This is the point where Mrs. Jennings returns and the misunderstanding from earlier is revealed, though Mrs. Jennings is certain that the rectory, with just a little care and attention, will actually be sufficient for Edward and Lucy to marry. We have this fantastic quote from her, quote, "The Colonel is a ninny, my dear. Because he has 2,000 a year himself, he thinks that nobody else can marry on less." Which is, really great, actually. It does speak, I think, to... I don't necessarily agree with Mrs. Jennings that this is confirmation of Colonel Brandon's ninnyhood as much as it is confirmation of Colonel Brandon's desire to be a responsible fellow, his desire to be a responsible husband, right? His desire to provide for his wife in very meaningful terms and not to have it be, a contrivance, a compromise for Edward and Lucy or for Colonel Brandon and any wife which might cross his path eventually. That he wants there to be a kind of, just a provision, a quality of life, right? It seems to me to be a testament to Colonel Brandon's affection for the women in his life in general, that he wants, that he cannot conceive of pulling a woman into a marriage with only £200 per year. That seems far too little. And a rundown little cottage. To Mrs. Jennings, on the other hand, we see kind of really leaning into her earlier dedication to love. She loves love. She wants the love story to have a happy ending. And that if that means that you go and live in a little rectory and everyone that you have met in London descends upon you to visit, then, it might not be so good in practice, but it's pretty good in principle. Let's see, how long do I have? I only have a few more minutes. Do I have You know what? I think we might just wrap up there, and we might begin chapter 41 next time, and we'll round out our entire discussion of the rest of the book. We're going to get into Lucy learning about the arrangement with Delaford. We get the distinction between Edward's generosity of response, right? He is so grateful, and Lucy is superficially very grateful, but actually uses it as a means of extracting promises of further assistance and further indulgence in the future, kind of really opening up a gap here between. We're also playing that game that I've mentioned before that's I really do think that it is more common in this book than in any of Austen's other work, but I do need to go back and study it more carefully. The idea that Edward's awkwardness, that his inability to express himself with completely composed, lines of poetry, that inelegance speaks of authenticity is a really interesting thing, particularly when we juxtapose that and Lucy's letter writing, which is so floral, which is so graceful, but yields a sense of inauthenticity in those moments. That then is going to do it for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Thank you guys so much for joining me live here on this Sunday afternoon. A very weird time to be recording. I'm going to walk out of my studio and it's going to be daylight, and that is going to feel strange for sure. I should note that I will be back on Thursday with the concluding episode of A Sense and Sensibility, Then the following week, we are going to move into, in fact, I have a slide. Let me call up the slide that I have so painstakingly prepared here, a very simple slide, with our outline for the next couple of weeks. September 18th, Sense and Sensibility, Volume 3, chapters 8 to 14. That is chapter 44 to 50. It's the end of the book. We're going to cover everything, I guess, starting at chapter 41, in fact. 41 to 50, we'll cover everything next Thursday night. And then the following week, we're going to study the first 10 chapters of The Har for our modern horror unit, which is so good. It's so exciting. This is David Sodergrund's 2022 novel, this dark wee thing set in the northeast of Scotland. We're going to cover that book in 3 weeks. It is pretty short. The readings are going to be pretty short. There is a lot to talk about, but I don't know that we're going to necessarily be pulling many slides in terms of our discussions, because what is happening on the page is almost less important than what is happening beneath the page when it comes to The Har. I would encourage you to check it out. It has some trigger warnings for gore and body horror and physical trauma, I suppose, but it is very much of this dark folkloric kind of text and tone. It's going to be a really interesting read. Rachel's telling me it's 6:40 here in Australia, 6:40 a.m. there in Australia. So you are also going to be walking out to daylight, right? I guess not, right? The winter in Australia, probably the sun has not yet risen. I don't know that much about Australia. I've never made it yet, Rachel, and one day I will. And I hope that that will be someday very soon, because quite frankly, I could do with seeing some more of the world. America is so charming in so many ways, and yet, wow, so difficult in so many others. That is going to do it for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Let me come back to my camera just to say farewell. Thank you so much for listening. Skipa, Rachel, thank you for joining me live. If you guys like this Sunday afternoon time, we can maybe make this happen a little more often. I know that I often speak about moving things around in the schedule, but the schedule is so packed now. It is so tight that it's not always as fluid as we would like. I now have to go, in fact, and spend the rest of the day prepping an episode of Shire Reckoning, which has to be recorded by this evening. So that's where I am, if you're wondering about the rest of my day. I hope that you guys have a fantastic day, Rachel. I hope that you enjoy your morning. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, please do take care. Good night, all.